Hello everyone. I am starting the unit political community. So the introduction is there are many different kinds of human associations such as households, families, companies, universities, trade unions, religious congregations, and friendship groups. We explore political communities in this chapter. We are distinguished from these other associations by two things. First, they are more encompassing since they establish the terms under which other associations regulate their affairs. Aristotle, for example, described the political community regulate their affairs as the highest community that embraces all the rest. Second, they are self-governing in the sense that the community itself gives shape to its laws and is not controlled by an external authority. Increasingly, this has come to mean that political communities should be democratic communities, which means that members should, in principle at least, be given an equal say over how their common affairs are conducted. In chapter 3rd and 4th, we look at how a political community might realize the ideal of democracy. Chapter 6th and 9th will explore some other important values that contemporary political communities have sought to honor. Meanwhile, in this chapter, political communities have sought to honor. We will focus on the question of what is that makes a political community a community. According to one very general account, communities are forms of social friendship that dispose us to show social concern and loyalty to people with whom we share things. In case of political communities, this definition leaves a number of issues open, such as what is that members are supposed to share in common and what forms of concerns and loyalty they are supposed to exhibit towards one another. In the first half of this chapter, we will explore five rivals perspectives, each of which supplies different answers to these questions and which are summarized in table 2.1 in the second half of these questions. In this chapter, we will compare these perspectives by exploring some important contemporary controversies about political membership. So, as table 2.1 illustrates the wide range of views contemporary political theorists have endorsed about political community and connected to their disagreements, and they have about culture, democracy, and human nature. In addition to these disagreements about what things are really like, political theorists also disagree about how things should be, and these normative disagreements also shape how different authors make sense of the ideal of the political community. For example, the liberal theory of political community contains a moral thesis which says that members should share a moral concern for one another as free and equal citizens. Although this is a demanding ideal, liberalism does not require that citizens much else in common with one another. So against this, communitarians argue that political community must be based on social bonds that are stronger or deeper than liberalism requires. For example, one communication has argued that ties of language, culture, history should bind members together to produce a collective consciousness and a world of common meanings. Meanwhile, liberal nationalists also criticize the conventional liberal theory of political community for being too thin, arguing that a shared national identity is for democracy and social justice. In turn, and against liberal nationalism and communitarianism, constitutional patriots favor a post-national form of political identity in which members share common political values but not necessarily a common national identity. Finally, multiculturalist and difference theorists have developed a radical critique of traditional theories of political community, arguing against the homogenizing tendencies they associated with other theories considered in this chapter. These different theories about the ideal of political community have important implications for how we think about citizenship or people membership. Thus, in the second half of this chapter, we will begin by looking at what the rights and duties of citizenship should be and focusing in particular on the question of whether these should be same for everyone or if minority group might be entitled to additional group specific rights. So, in the developed world, controversies about minority rights have often arisen alongside other controversies relating to immigration, integration, and citizenship. And constitutionally, we will also explore how the different theories of political community can provide different frameworks to address these issues. As should become clear, an important question is the immigration debate is whether immigration threatens democracy, and we will explore how the different theories of political communities applies us with different ways of thinking about necessary conditions for democratic self-government. And finally, to conclude this chapter, we will examine some future challenges that the ideal of political community is likely to face in light of the ongoing transformations associated with the phenomenon of globalization. So, we are starting the topic rival perspectives. So many liberals are spectacle about the community talk that is now a familiar part of political. And one reason for this is that liberalism is an individualistic doctrine which places a premium on individual freedom and rights, and consequently its adherents often worry that promoting a strong sense of communal identification could stifle freedom and individuality. As it has been developed, political theorists such as John Rawls, Ronald Dworkin, and Charles Lermore, the liberal ideal of political community does not require that members share in a single comprehensive way of life, speak the same language, or even be sentimentally attached to one another. Rather, what matters is that members recognize one another as a people to whom they owe a duty of justification because of the moral concern they share for one another as a free and equal citizens. And the reservations of these liberals may be something of a historical aberrations. For example, the new liberals of the early 20th century like T.H. Green, L.T. Hobhouse, and John Hobson were positively enthusiastic about community, and many of the classical liberals of the 19th century such as John Stuart Mill looked favorably on the cause of national self-determination. However, these sympathies are found less frequently in recent liberal writings, with the notable exceptions of the liberal nationalists, who we will consider later. To make sense of how liberals understood political community, three background features of liberalism itself need to be set out. First is the assumption of pluralism, which is the exception that the political culture of a society of pluralism sorry, that the political culture of a society governed by the liberal institutions will be marked by a diversity of opposing and irreconcilable religious, philosophical, and moral doctrines. As we shall see in chapter 3, liberals accept citizens to disagree about the ultimate ends and purpose of human life, for instance, about what morality requires of us and about which plans and projects are worthwhile or meaningful. Moreover, they believe that this kind of pluralism will be a feature of social life, and that convergence around a single religious, philosophical, or moral doctrine cannot be sustained without operations. Second is the requirement of public justification, which follows from a distinctive understanding of political legitimacy. As we shall see in chapter 3, liberals tend to argue that the coercive exercise of power, and if only if it can justify to those who are subject to it. Exercise of political power is fully proper only when it exercised in accordance with constitution, essential of which all citizens as free and equal may reasonably be accepted to endorsed in light of principles and ideals acceptable to their common human reasons. Importantly, the requirement of public justification does not go so far as to require that all institutions and laws are in fact endorsed by all citizens. Rather, it requires that coercive power be justified. Importantly, the requirement of public justification does not go so far as to require that all institutions and laws are in fact endorsed by all citizens. Rather, it requires that coercive power be justified by reasons that are in principle acceptable to all, and for this reason it is sometimes described as a form of hypothetical consent. The third relevant feature is the requirement of neutrality, in its most basic form, this means that the liberal state should be neutral amongst the different religious, philosophical, or moral views endorsed by its members. Because all citizens are to be treated with respect, and because pluralism is a permanent feature of social life, the purpose of laws and institutions is to provide fair feature of social life. The purpose of laws and institutions to be provide fair background conditions against which individuals are able to pursue their own plans and projects in accordance with their own beliefs about the good life. In particular, liberals object to using laws and institutions to promote particular views about the purpose of human life, for example religious views. Combining these three features delivers by demanding ideal of political community which many contemporary societies do not live up to. For example, consider a society that upholds a blasphemy law on the grounds of majority preference, and where the majority makes no effort to justify their preference in terms that could be accepted by minority. Such a society does not uphold the liberal ideals of community, and since the majority have failed to recognize at least some of their fellow citizens as people to whom they owe a duty of justification. So the topic is now communitarianism. Since the 1980s, a number of communitarian political theorists such as Elster, Charles Taylor, Michael Walzer, and Michael Sandel have developed a broad and multi-faced critique of liberalism, covered a wide range of methodological and philosophical issues, and at the heart of their project is the idea that liberal individualism and in particular the conception of personhood associated with it neglects the profound significance of social ties as well as the ways in which people identities are constituted by their unchosen membership. According to communitarians, our particular culture and national membership profoundly shape our identities, goals, and the ways in which we understand the world. Because liberals set aside these particular characteristics and instead focus on universal ones all people share all people share, and they end up with an ideal of community that communitarians think to be unappealing and incoherent. Let us start with the first of these objections, that liberal community is unappealing. Communitarians diagnose an unhealthy individualism in modern society and blame this on the pervasive influence of liberal ideas. According to them, liberalism, with its emphasis on individual rights and freedoms, puts the individual before the community, and a liberal political order with tend to create selfish and atomized people with their own private interest and incapable of appreciating and acting for the common good. Liberalism, on this view, had disrupted the deep and natural ties of community, replacing them with the shallow. And some liberal responses to this criticism and discussed. One point worth noting it is that if the communitarians are right and our societies are now fragmented as a consequence of the pernicious influence of the liberal ideas, then this might actually be an argument for liberalism. And if we doomed to live in a society of strangers, then what better political theory than liberalism with its commitment to freedom, justice, rights to cope up with the society? The second communitarian objection is that the liberal ideal of community is inherent because it rests on implausible conception of the person. Communitarians believe that liberals underestimate the deep and enduring significance of our loyalties, social ties, and inherited identities, and constantly endorse an unrealistic conception of the person that neglects the complex way in which we are embedded in and even constituted by our communities. The basis of this objection is that liberals insist that individuals must be free to alter their beliefs and practices, and they not be constrained by tradition, law, and social pressure. However, communitarians think that this ideal conjures up an image of a person who is, in some sense, detached from their beliefs and practices. which Michael Sandel captures by saying that liberals are committed to a peculiar vision of an uh, un- uh, unencumbered self. A self is unencumbered when it has no roles, communities, or projects that are so essential that turning away from them would call into the question the person I am. Not only would an unencumbered self lack character and moral depth, since these things depend on an awareness of the ways in which we are shaped by our histories and cultures, but it also goes against our deepest self understandings because it rests on a mistaken understanding of how we relate to our beliefs and practices. According to communitarians, the practices that give meaning to our life are social practices which are not fully our own creations but instead complex products drawing on the histories and cultures into which we are born and socialized. For example, the choice to pursue a career in the theatre will be given its meanings by the ways which arts are understood within a practical culture, and taking socialization seriously means that we should recognize that our choices are not made in vacuum but are based on options that are given meanings to us by our linguistic culture and communal heritages. And on the communitarian accounts, liberals neglect this complexity and in doing so themselves to an conception of personhood. This aspect of the communitarian creative critique give rise to an important disagreement about the relationship between politicals and community. On the one hand, liberals emphasize the importance of equipping individuals to caution their social roles and want to provide them with the opportunity and resources to step back and critically evaluate their beliefs and practices. On the other hand, communitarians think that liberal individuals neglects the social character of freedom and instead want to commit the state to promoting a politicals of the common good. And now the topic is liberal nationalism. Liberals and communitarians disagree about the doctrine of state neutrality, while the liberal state is agnostic about the content of its members' beliefs and practices, provided that they are not harmful to others. Communitarians favor using political power to support collective goals or a vision of the common good. And since the 1990s, a number of liberal nationalist political theories such as Margaret Canavan, David Miller, and have carved out a new position that reaches across this divide. Like the earlier wave of communitarians, liberal nationalists were reacting against what they perceived to be shortcomings within orthodox liberalism. However, there is a more sympathetic critique which aims to retain the basic features of the liberal worldview. And although this theory comes in many different forms, liberal nationalists advance two basic claims. The first of these is that liberalism is compatible with some of the practices and principles associated with nationalism, including national building and compatriot priority. National building is refers to promoting a sense of shared nationality throughout the polity, for instance, by teaching the national history and literature in schools, by subsidizing distinctive culture, traditions, and practices, by supporting the national language, and by encouraging the practices by supporting the national language and by encouraging the celebration of national holidays. The practice of national building is controversial as it potentially conflicts with the liberal commitment to the neutrality. So, the second basic claim of liberal nationalism is the liberal politics and institutions depend upon members sharing a common national culture. This claim is much stronger than the first one since it says that not only are liberals permitted to promote national cultures or priorities, the interest of compatriots, but also that liberals must do these things. At its most basic, the argument is that if we want to have welfare states, that then we will need the kind of solidarity that shared nationality fosters. And this metaphor suggests a conception of the nation as repository of loyalty, trust, and belonging that the state can draw upon when it needs to mobilize its citizens. Liberal nationalities worry that If a state lacks this battery, then it will be unable to convince its members to make compromises with or sacrifice for one another. On this view, Orthodox liberals have been too squeamish about the patience of political loyalty and belonging, since despite their intensity, these things are necessary if democratic community is to flourish. So this part of the liberal nationalist argument invokes a set of controversial hypotheses. For example, liberal nationalists believe that we are more likely to accept and welcome democratic decisions when they made by co-nationals, that we are happier to pay taxes for the benefit of our co-nationals, and that we are more willing to participate in democratic life if we share that life with members of our own national group. So if these hypotheses are true, then liberals should take heed of communitarian concerns about the importance of social ties. Particularly, they should be committed to both promoting a sense of shared nationality throughout the polity to ensuring that political boundaries coincide with national ones. Even more controversially, as we shall see, liberal nationalists also favor using migrations control to ensure that national cultures retain their character and integrity. So our top uh, next topic is constitutional patriotism. Liberal nationalism was a controversial addition to both the liberal tradition and to the theory of political community. Some criticists deny that liberalism and nationalism are compatible. Others reject liberal nationalist claims that about the significance of nationhood, and still others think that nationalism is too explosive and a phenomenon to legitimize. And interestingly, some of the underlying preoccupations of the liberal nationalists have also emerged in the writings of an anti-nationalist group of political theorists which who have developed a theory known as constitutional patriotism. And initially, this theory emerged as a part of attempt to work out an acceptable form of collective identifications for a post-national Germany, and more recently, it has created European Union might take in the future. Although an early version of the position was developed by political scientists Dov Sternberger, its contemporary prominence is largely owed to writings of philosopher Jürgen Habermas and his followers, including Jan Werner Muller and Anna Stills. Like the liberal nationalists and their communitarian predecessors, constitutional patriots are concerned about the fragmentary tendencies of modern complex societies and emphasize the importance of political loyalty and membership. However, instead of appealing to the unifying force of shared nationality, constitutional patriots want to uncouple nation and state and believe that post-national political allegiance uh, should be based on shared civic loyalty to the principle and practices of a democratic community. By connecting political membership to abstract and universal principles, constitutional patriots point to form of political community that does not depend on the exclusionary ties of shared history and ethnicity and culture. Thus, liberal nationalists push liberalism in a uh, particularistic and communitarian direction. Constitutional patriots emphasize its universalistic and cosmopolitan aspects. The central claim of constitutional patriotism is that the post-national political identity should be based on the recognition of democratic values and human rights as they are contextualized in a particular constitutional tradition. This means that political attachment should be focused on the values that are reflected in a democratic constitution, such as fairness, democracy, equality, dignity, and freedom. Importantly, constitutional patriots do not think that political loyalty should be directed as the constitution itself, since the contestation of particular constitutional provisions is a symptom of a reflective citizenry and vigorous political community. What matters is that citizens share a basic moral framework within which they can resolve political disputes, and it is the absence of such framework that threatens political community. The contrast with liberal nationalism here is worth noting, and meanwhile, for nationalist political community is at risk when citizens are not united by ties of common nationality. Three major lines of argument have been advanced against constitutional patriotism. First is the civil religion objection, which says that constitutional patriotism risks turning the political community into a kind of conventional state. Why should this be so? Constitutional patriots think that political community would be arranged around shared political principles. If those principles are rejected by some citizens, such as members of orthodox and traditional religious communities, then constitutional patriots worry that political community will not be valuable, and constantly efforts must be made to inculcate the necessary principle amongst citizens, for instance by teaching them in schools and promoting them in public culture. But according to critics, this kind of manipulation is incompatible with the principle of freedom of conscience, and meanwhile constitutional patriots respond to this by pointing out that the dispositions which they wish to cultivate do not include unquestioning obedience. Recall, the constitutional patriots do not want citizens to venerate the constitutions itself or its founding fathers. Second objection is that constitutional patriotism is unrealistic. Communitarians and nationalists point out that real political communities have much more in common with their models than with those of the constitutional patriots, and that this is because patriotic attachment to be political ideas and patriots and that this patriots values are too weak to sustain the strong ties of membership that political community depends upon. And Bernard Yak, for example, suggests that even if attachment to constitutional principle is now a necessary condition for political loyalty, it is not a sufficient one. To illustrate this, he points out that how much residents of United States might sympathize with the political principles favored by most French or Canadian citizens, it would not overdo them to think out themselves as French or Canadian. On his account, real political community is always based on ties that are less rational and voluntary than those emphasized by constitutional patriots. For example, despite the influence of constitutional patriotism in German political and cultural life, when the opportunity for reunification arose, shared nationality proved to be far more important to East-West Germans than their attachments to political principles. Finally, a third objection is that because constitutional patriotism appeals to universal political ideas and values, it cannot be explained what binds people to their own political communities. For example, liberal nationalist David Miller makes the following arguments. A constitution usually contains a statement of principle and the institutions that will intact them. The principles themselves are likely to be generally informed, more or less the common currency of liberal democracies. Subscribing to them marks you out a liberal rather than a fascist or an anarchist, but it does not provide the kind of identity that nationality provides. In particular, it does not explain why the boundaries of the political community should be fall here rather than there. If Miller is right, then constitutional patriotism can supplement but cannot replace nationalism within the theory of political community. This is because it cannot tell us who and where the political community is, but only how political community should be done. Meanwhile, Jan Werner Miller has suggested that although constitutional patriotism has to rely on existing political units and is not a freestanding theory of political boundary formation, it can address objections such as Miller's by criticizing political allegiance in terms of attachment to a particular constitutional culture. On this treaty, membership is about endorsing universal political principle within your own particular cultural and historical setting. Thus, the task of patriotic citizens is to sustain and rework particular constitutional culture, which we are trying to express universal norms of justice and fairness in specific contexts.
We'll start with the reading, which is named as Issues in Political Theory. And under this, we'll study the topic citizenship. Now, we'll start with page number 242. Many of the most lively and important debates about citizenship have taken place under realistic assumptions about political boundaries, human nature, the operation of democratic institutions, and cultural diversity. In this chapter, I shall outline and comment on what I take to be the most interesting of these debates. First, I shall engage the question of how to determine the duties of citizens to one another within the boundaries of political associations. Second, I shall address what these duties tell us about the proper design of political institutions and explain how different democratic designs can make it more or less difficult for citizens to carry out their duties. Third, I shall look at the vitally important question of differences among citizens and whether those differences require us to loosen the unitary conception of citizenship that emerged with the nation state. Fourth, I shall briefly survey the question of who is morally entitled to citizenship of a country, and finally, as a lead in to the case study, I shall discuss some of the problems associated with the creation of citizens, the education of children into the duties of citizenship. A word first about what citizenship means in the context of these discussions. Like most important terms in political theory, citizen has both a descriptive and a normative aspect. The descriptive aspect is simple. One is a citizen of a country, A, if one is recognized by that country as a full member of the political community and granted the rights and duties that it reserves for full members. So, for example, I am a citizen of the UK simply because the UK government recognizes me as such, grants me the right to vote, issues me with a passport, and allows me to contribute to and benefit from the welfare state. The US government does not recognize me as a full member and denies me the right to vote, to stand for office, etc., although it does grant me an intermediate status in which I am a full contributor to and a partial beneficiary of the welfare state. My children, by contrast, are immature citizens of both countries. Both governments will allow them to vote. Bracket, if resident in the UK's case, bracket closed, when they reach the age of majority, will issue them with passports and will allow them full participation rights in the respective welfare states. For most citizens who are recognized as such from birth, even egregious crimes do not result in forfeiture of their status as citizens. Bracket, although it may result in forfeiture of some of the associated rights. Bracket close. The most notorious convicted murderers in the UK and the USA are still citizens of those countries, albeit citizens that have been temporarily or permanently stripped of the rights to vote or of freedom of association. But the normative aspect of citizenship goes beyond the descriptive. Perhaps the USA ought to grant me the full rights of political membership, even though it does not do so at present. Maybe, even though they have committed terrible crimes, murderers should retain the right to vote. Whether they should or not, being granted status as a full member of the political community carries with it certain responsibilities to other members of that community. Moral duties that may be different from the duties we have to non citizens, or at least to those whom we have a right to regard as non citizens. The debates described in this chapter are aimed precisely at filling out the normative aspect of the meaning of citizenship. Now we move on to page number 243, and the topic of the reading on this page is the rights and duties of citizenship. What might the rights and duties of citizenship include? Let us first consider the rights of citizenship. There is a great deal of consensus that citizens should have certain basic rights, including freedom of speech, conscience, and association, and the right to vote, deliberate, and stand for office in democratic elections. There is also consensus on what the core meaning of these rights are, although there is obviously disagreement at the margins. Does the right to freedom of expression include the right to racist speech or to pornographic expression? There is much less consensus on rights that more directly and obviously involve the provision of resources to citizens. Most left leaning theorists believe that justice demands rights to healthcare, decent public health measures, provision of education, and a social safety net to ensure against unemployment and indigence. Libertarian theorists, in particular, argue against these rights, usually on the grounds that supplying them would require infractions of more fundamental liberties of others, including especially strong property rights. Instead, I shall focus on the most interesting dispute about the duties of citizens. Again, there is a great deal of consensus, even among academics, on one large set of duties. Citizens have a strong prima facie duty to obey laws that have been passed through democratic procedures, to contribute their fair share to maintaining a just society, and to tolerate the consensual behavior of other adults as long as such behavior does not impose heavy costs on third parties. Bracket, although, again, there are debates at the margins about how strong these prima facie duties are and what constitutes a fair share and heavy costs. The most interesting recent debates focus on the duties of citizens to deliberate when voting. Now we move on to the next paragraph with the theory of full compliance, that is, that everybody all the time acts as justice requires. John Rawls asserts the following condition on the legitimacy of law. Exercise of political power is fully proper only when it is exercised in accordance with the Constitution, the essentials of which all citizens, as free and equal, may reasonably be expected to endorse in the light of principles and ideals acceptable to their common human reason. So, this was the assertion of John Rawls, which I just read right now. Moving on, this does not, in fact, require that everyone actually accept the Constitution in question. Rather, that reasonably people can be expected to accept the constitutional essentials. But it does strongly suggest that attempts to justify constitutional measures and even some actual laws which rely for their justification on principles and ideals that one knows not to be shared by others who are reasonable are illegitimate. Think of recent efforts in the USA to alter state constitutions to prevent legislatures from legalizing same sex marriage. Defenders of such alterations offer reasons that they know are disputed by other reasonable people and sometimes offer reasons, for example, the appeal to biblical authority, that they know many other reasonable people could not accept as having any weight at all. Now we move on to the next page, which is 244. I'll be reading out the key thinkers box, which is 11.1. So, Amy Gutman. So, Amy Gutman is author of, among other books, Democratic Education, bracket 1989, bracket close, Identity in Democracy, and Color Conscious Democratic Education Placed Preparation for Citizenship at the center of an account of the ideal content and distribution of education opportunities. Her subsequent book, bracket with Dennis Thompson, bracket close, Democracy and Disagreement, develops her distinctive account of the obligations of citizens and demonstrates its implications for a wide range of policy areas. After founding the Lawrence S. Rockefeller University Center of Human Values at Princeton University, she served as provost, and since 2004 she has been president of the University of Pennsylvania. Now we move on with the reading. Inspired by Rawls' principle of legitimacy, Amy Gutman and Dennis Thompson suggest the citizens have the duty to observe what they call the norm of reciprocity. Any claim fails to respect reciprocity if it imposes a requirement on other citizens to adopt one sectarian way of life as a condition of gaining access to moral understanding that is essential to judging the validity of one's moral claims. So, this was the norm of reciprocity. If you think about Rawls' principle of legitimacy, the norm of reciprocity seems to be reasonable demand, but it is a strong demand. In particular, it requires many people to restrain themselves from advancing in political debate or voting on the basis of some of their most deeply held moral convictions. A Christian who believes that homosexuality is a sin, but also knows that reasonable people disagree with him or her, is required to bracket that belief both when arguing in public debate and when voting in privacy of the polling booth. For William Galston, the norm is too demanding. It may well make sense to urge all citizens to do their best to translate their commitments into terms that can be understood by citizens who do not share them. But the norm of reciprocity should not be interpreted to screen out the kinds of core beliefs that give meaning and purpose to many lives. This caveat is especially important in the United States, where levels of religious belief and observance are far higher than any other industrialized democracy. It is difficult to believe that any liberal democracy can sustain conscientious support if it tells millions of its citizens that they cannot rightly say what they believe as part of democratic public dialogue. So, this is the William Galston uh, point of view. Now, moving on with the reading. At first glance, the norm of reciprocity does seem to be extremely demanding, and Galson's interpretation seems to be a plea, really, to reject it. Galson's comment contains two objections, both of which depend on the observation that the norm requires people to distance themselves from some of their deepest beliefs about what gives meaning and value to their lives. Deeply religious and especially evangelical citizens are often taken to experience this requirement most demandingly because they hold views that they believe others would be much better off sharing, and also sometimes believe that some practices are sufficiently bad for those who engage in them that those people would be better off if they were to be prevented from engaging in the practices. Now we are moving on to the page number 245. Now, there is a box on this page on William Galston, which I'll be reading out before continuing the reading. William Galston is author of Liberal Purposes, Liberal Pluralism, and the Practice of Liberal Pluralism. He has developed in those books and other works a distinctive approach to political theorizing, which starts with attention to real world problems and investigates them under the assumption that, however they are addressed, some valuable goods will be lost. After many years at the School of Public Policy of the University of Maryland, he recently became a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, a leading policy think tank in Washington, D.C. From 1992 to 4, he served as the White House domestic policy advisor to the President Clinton. Now moving on with the reading. But their reasons for holding these views are not easily made available for scrutiny by people who do not already share their religious faith. So, for example, some religious citizens believe, on the basis of scripture, that homosexual practices are deeply wrong and very harmful to those who engage in them. If I do not share their attitude toward the authority of scripture, I cannot accept that as the basis for viewing homosexual practices as morally harmful. If they use that belief as a justification for laws forbidding homosexual practices or restricting the social goods attached to marriage to heterosexual couples, they are thereby violating their norm of reciprocity. So the two objections are as follows. Number one, it is wrong for people to refrain from deploying their most fundamental moral beliefs in justification of political measures. People should, as a matter of personal integrity, deploy all of the resources at their disposal, including what they sincerely believe to be the truth. Number two, although there would not, in principle, be anything wrong with people exercising restraint in political action, it is wrong to ask them to do so because it is simply too demanding. Most of us, most of the time, are unable, as a matter of psychological fact, to divide our personal and our political moralities in the way that the norm of reciprocity expects. In fact, neither of these objections succeeds in defeating the norm. Now, let us consider the first. It seems right that people should act in their personal lives on what they believe to be the truth about morality. But as soon as other people are the objects of their concern, there are limits on the extent to which they can deploy the truth. This is both because we are highly imperfectly informed about the details of other people's life, so that it is very difficult for us to apply our moral values in ways that render good judgments, and also because respecting the status of other people as moral agents requires that we give them space to make their own judgments about what is good and how to pursue it. When we see another adult acting in a way that we think will lead them, but only them, into harm, it is right to use moral suasion, and it can be right to judge them as. We are moving on to the next page, which is 246. So I'll repeat the sentence. When we see another adult acting in a way that we think will lead them, but only them, into harm, it is right to use moral suasion, and it can be right to judge them as wrongdoers and allow that action to influence our own behavior toward them. But it is often not right even to manipulate them, let alone forcibly to prevent them from acting in that way. The norm of reciprocity extends this insight to the use of state power, but it does so moderately. Whereas in our personal lives, we typically refrain entirely from coercing other generally competent adults for their own good. Even if we can explain the reasons that they should act differently in terms of what they readily accept, the norm of reciprocity allows political power to be used when those conditions are met. Respecting other people's moral agency places some constraints on the way in which we justify coercing them, and those constraints include distancing ourselves somewhat from our personal world views. The response to the first objection suggests a way of dealing with the second. In fact, the norm is not too demanding, at least for most reasonable people, because they can understand readily that they do not have a claim over how others lead their lives. They can understand that they are bound by requirement to respect other people's moral agency, and they can endeavor to engage appropriately in politics. This is not to say, this is not to say that they will always succeed. Not everyone always lives up to the ideals they give themselves, and if they were to do so, that would probably be a sign of the insufficient demands of those idols rather than of their moral characters. But such a claim that the demand is sufficiently demanding that most people will, on occasions, fail to live up to it is not damning. Now, there is a box which has a box of key points. So I'll read the key points out. Number 1, citizenship confers rights and imposes duties. Number 2, among the duties is the obligation to abide by the norm of reciprocity in public deliberation. Number 3, this norm is grounded in a conception of democratic legitimacy. Now we start with our next topic, which is the duties of citizenship and democratic design. How might the norm of reciprocity inform the design of political institutions? The norm is, in part, a demand on citizens themselves. But how demanding it is on the citizen depends on a range of institutional factors. Think about the simple matter of acquiring good information about the likely behavior of the politician for whom one votes. In the absence of a strong party system, it can be very difficult to acquire such information, especially if there are several levels of government. Think of the typical US voter who faces a weak party system and frequent elections at numerous levels of government, in several levels of which no party is involved at all. Most vote in something close to ignorance of what their representatives' likely behavior is, and with very limited understanding of the range of powers that he or she will have. A voter in a typical US state, for example, is expected to vote between 2 and 4 times every year, and for officials in between 10 and 14 separate kinds of government race, in several of which party affiliation does not appear on the ballot. Now, think about the sphere of public discourse about politics. If it is structured to elicit reasonable engagement in terms of public reason, that is, the common reason that all citizens in a pluralistic democracy use to advance their justifications of public policies, it will be easier for almost everybody to observe the norm that if it is designed only to facilitate politicians rallying the faithful. If 30-second TV commercials are the main mechanisms of political communication, reasonableness is less likely to reign. Other things being equal, than if politicians were to be pressured to participate in extended debates with each other and with other interested parties. Similarly, a system in which journalists routinely have incentives to defer to the claims of the politicians, in which Similarly, a system in which journalists routinely have incentives to defer to the claims of the politicians they interview is less likely to facilitate public reasoning than one in which journalists are well informed and approach their interviewees as equals. Some theorists have argued that public funding of elections is a prerequisite of reasonable public debate, because private funding is bound not only to favor those with most disposable income, but also to skew political expression in favor of private interests. This may not be true. It may be possible to design regulations of a system depending on private donations to elicit public reasons, but it is not clear that we have any examples of successful deliberative democracies that rely on private financing of election campaigns. In addition, Jeremy Waldron has argued powerfully that the institution of judicial review, that is, a mechanism whereby legislation can be challenged through the courts on the ground that if it infringes one or more of the rights recognized by a constitution, provides a disincentive for citizens and politicians to engage in morally responsible public debate and deliberation, because it absolves them from the responsibility for incorporating concern with the rights of others into their lawmaking behavior. This thus frees them to make maximally self interested demands, understanding that the process itself will moderate those demands. Waldron's focus is on the US model of judicial review, in which the Constitution, including the Bill of Rights clause, has complete priority over legislation. So legislators know that the courts get the last say. That is not the only available model, of course. In Canada, Parliament and provincial legislatures have the power explicitly to override certain parts of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and while the UK Parliament has passed a Human Rights Act, it retains the power to override it by a majority vote. Still, even in those circumstances, as long as there is no explicit proposal to override or withdraw the rights, it is possible that politicians and voters will refrain from considering the full moral import of their proposals. Finally, if children are poorly educated or are educated to advance their own interest rather than to deliberate carefully about public matters as adults, they will find it harder than they otherwise might to observe the norm. Just as if they are not taught a foreign language, it will be harder than it otherwise would be to speak a foreign language. So, features of democratic design, such as requiring public debates, parliamentary scrutiny, and education for all that emphasizes higher cognitive operations and the knowledge and skills that underlie good deliberation, will have a significant impact on how demanding the norm of reciprocity is. Now we move on to page number 248, and here a box is given. Point number 1, a box is given of key points. So point number 1, how difficult is it to abide by the duties of citizenship depends on democratic design. Point 2, overly complicated democratic citizens can undermine the norm of reciprocity, as can the private financing of elections. Point number 3, judicial review, although designed to protect fundamental rights, can undermine responsible deliberation. And point number 4, the education system has some responsibility for creating good citizens. Now we start another topic, which is unitary or differentiated citizenship. So far, I have assumed that the rights and duties of citizenship are the same for all citizens over the course of their lives. You can think of this as the unitary conception of citizenship assumption. Rights and laws apply equally to all, regardless of their ethnic background, religious commitments, and sense of identity. In fact, the unitary conception, obvious as it might seem in some contemporary democracies, is frequently transgressed. Most democratic countries, for example, recognized women as citizens before granting them the same voting rights as those of men. In the Ottoman Empire, the millet system distinguished Muslims, Armenians, and Phanerite Greeks and Jews as distinct, quasi autonomous, self governing millets. All were full subjects of the empire, but the level of self governance was sufficiently extensive that members of different millets enjoyed quite different areas of legal rights and duties. And Canada and the USA have each long had complex set of arrangements with quasi-sovereign tribes of Indians who, although full citizens of their respective countries, enjoy more self-governance than the unitary conception of citizenship would suggest. Many of the latter arrangements are the result of treaties between the federal governments and tribes over which, prior to the treaties, the federal governments had no legitimate authority. As such, they are not widely disputed in principle, except insofar as the treaties are regarded as illegitimate because the federal governments attained consent through threat of force. A deeper question arises about whether, within a multicultural society within which no such treaties operate, members of some cultural, ethnic, or religious minorities have a legitimate claim to differentiated citizenship. The most influential and careful defender of the idea of group differentiated citizenship is Canadian philosopher Will Kimlicka. What is especially interesting about his argument is that it does not turn on the idea that those to whom group rights might be granted are the victims of past injustice. Even without any history of injustice between two groups, group differentiated rights must be justified. The central government proceeds in two stages. The central argument proceeds in two stages. First, Kimlicka, so I'll spell the name Kimlicka. So he argues that membership of a cultural community should count as a primary good. In Rawlsian sense, which Rawlsian would be spelled as Rawlsian. So Rawlsian sense of a good that any rational person would want, whatever else she wanted, and then that its status as a primary good justifies some special cultural rights and protections, which conflict with and override some standard liberal rights. So we are moving on to the 249 page number now. This stage of the argument proceeds by analogy with Rawls' argument for the basic liberties. Rawls identifies self-respect as a good that is crucial to the ability to pursue our conception of the good. That is, the package of substantive commitments which includes beliefs, preferences, and habits relating to how to live life well. But we can only have self-respect and the confidence in ourselves and conception of the good that accompanies it if we have a conception of the good with which we can identify. In turn, this requires that we have the conditions in which we can realistically form and revise our beliefs about how to live. This interest in the capacity to form and revise our conception of the good supports very firm guarantees for freedom of expression, freedom of association, and freedom of conscience. But the ability to form and revise our conception of the good is not only dependent on our own capacities and guarantees of freedom. It also depends on there being background cultural and intellectual institutions on which we can realistically draw in developing our beliefs. We do not spontaneously form our beliefs about the good life. Rather, we take up and subject to scrutiny and revision the ideas that surround us. The background culture, in other words, provides a context of choice without which the liberty to form and revise our conception of the good is empty, in the sense that it cannot serve the interest that justifies it. Thus, cultural structure provides a context of choice that is essential for self-respect. So, membership in a cultural structure is a primary good in in much the same way as are some of the basic liberties protected by the liberty principle. It is important that this argument is true to traditional liberalism in that it is entirely individualistic in form. It does not assert the primacy of group interest over individual interest, or any obligation of the individual to subjugate his or her interests to those of the group to which he or she happens to belong. Group membership is recognized to be, in some strong sense, morally arbitrary